guys. Welcome back to the other side. I'm so happy you can make it back to join us. Here we talk about trials, triumphs, and everything in between, as well as some tips on how you can just become a better you. So that's what we're doing today. I have a friend, now friend. She was somebody I met at an event, Andrea Vargas. She is a family therapist and family and
Marriage and family therapist.
marriage and family therapist. Yes.
Hello.
So, hello, Andrea. Thanks for joining us
Oh, thank you for
again.
having me back.
I love it. Oh, just so you know, today we're going to be talking about loss,
And grief.
and grief.
Grief.
Yes, loss and grief. Because, I had gone or I was going to go to an event that my sister was speaking of and it was about loss and
hmm
grief. And I assumed because of the suicide and those it was for that only. And I didn't want to take up somebody's space. And then she mentioned, there was other people there, like now empty nesters and just, people with different types of grief, right? And
hmm
it got me thinking like, wow, I should have went. I mean, I just had a divorce. That's also
Yes.
like a loss and a grieving process. And so I was like, who am I going to call? Andrea, we got to do this. So I
Thank
wanted
you.
to bring it, to all of them because we have our own idea of what grief is and what loss is, but there's so many different types. And I just thought it'd be an important discussion to bring to the audience and let them know, that there are different types and there's different
Yes.
ways of dealing with different types of grief. So I'll hand the baton over to you now.
Yes. I think grief is I think we all grieve differently, but the most common thing is that we all know what it is, right? Because we've all experienced loss. And I think that loss and grief isn't just grieving death, but it's
Mhm.
also grieving life, right? And we grieve life all the time. We grieve not just what happens, but also what doesn't happen.
Right.
And so I think that oftentimes we get stuck in like, oh, at this age, I was supposed to like accomplish this or this was supposed to happen. And so we don't really see that as grief, like what didn't happen for us. And
Mhm.
it is also part of grief because it comes through a process and you have to heal what didn't happen for you or like expectations that you had
Right.
that didn't actually come to fruition.
That is so true. And it's just like in my industry in real estate, goal setting,
hmm
right? And we all have these plans and these ideas, but life has its own plans and its
Correct.
own ideas. And we don't see that as grief. Like, yeah, it's kind of a quick, like, it didn't work out, move on. But sometimes there are times that we do need to sit with it a little bit and see how it affected us and maybe why it affected us so badly or deal with it because it could affect us and then we don't deal with it and we don't realize how it affects our work moving forward or
Yeah.
life,
And,
right?
and we start to experience grief at a very young age, but we don't often speak to children about grief and
Mhm.
loss. And I think that for a lot of kids, like if we look at child development, also when we see that they go through different stages, like I know that oftentimes when kids go from toddler age to like TK kindergarten age, like they transition into no longer being like babies per se, and they start school and they start to become a little bit more independent. And so transitions in our lives are also we also process grief through those changes and transitions in our lives. And a very common one too is when you become an adult, right?
Yeah.
Like you go from like you go to sleep and you're 17 and you're a child, and then you
Yes.
wake up and you're 18 and you're an adult, and
Yes.
everybody expects you to know how to be an adult and what to do and how to behave and
Mhm.
how to take care of yourself. And so those transitions also come with a lot of grief because we grieve not being a child anymore. We grieve not being a teenager. And teenagers also go through grief. And that's why depression is very common through adolescence because you're grieving not being a child anymore, and being an adolescent is like you're in limbo, like you're not a child but you're not an adult, so
Yes.
you're like trying to figure yourself out, you're trying to figure out your autonomy. And so we go through these when we go through these transitions in life, we also grieve versions of ourselves that are no longer. And
Yes.
I don't think we often see transitions and changes in our lives as grief.
Mhm.
And grief, they everybody knows the 5 stages of grief, right? But it's not stages, it's we are multidimensional, and grief comes with a lot of other emotions
Mhm.
because we are emotional beings. So Grief comes with sadness, it comes with anger, it comes with disappointment, it comes with sometimes disbelief, right? Because it's like we can't believe that I'm no longer a kid, or like adulting, like everybody
Yeah.
says adulting is so hard. And
Yes.
it's like, yeah, like you miss
I'm
being
gonna
a
be
child.
54 and I'm like, "Oh, I have to adult today,
Yeah.
every day," I mean, I love life, but, I love life. But yes, we have those moments. It's like,
Yeah, and and your youth, and for a lot of women, aging is grieving too because you're no longer this youthful thing. And
mhm.
we as a society just love youth, right? But I think we also have wisdom with aging. And so how do we allow ourselves to connect to our grief? And
Mhm.
oftentimes we don't.
Right.
And so we feel all of this sadness, and sometimes we go through like these phases of rage without realizing that at the end of the day it's grief that we're feeling,
Yeah.
and we're carrying in our bodies, and we're not really processing it, and it's just kind of sitting with us.
Mhm.
And so the more we carry, the more sad we feel. And a
Yeah.
lot of times depression, at the end of the day, depression is sadness, right?
Yep.
And sadness is a part of grief. So a lot of times we have to also understand that when we are feeling this sadness and we're not connecting to it and we're not allowing ourselves to release it, it stays stuck within us. And so how do we give ourselves permission to grieve?
Yeah, and I really believe that's where a lot of the ailments come from.
Oh, for
A lot
sure.
of the cancers and a lot of, well, I mean, people break out in shingles because they're
Hmm.
stressed out. They don't even realize that they're stressed out sometimes, but their body lets them know.
Well, most autoimmune diseases are directly correlated to emotions, right?
Mm.
Because they usually are triggered when you're under a lot of
Yeah.
stress. And so it's different emotions that we are carrying in our bodies that we're not processing and that we're not releasing, that it or manifests into illnesses.
Yeah. Yeah, see, there's something to be said for a good F this every once in a while,
Yeah.
right?
And a good cry, right?
Yeah.
Like once we get older, like our very first language when we come into this world is crying.
Yes.
Like the first thing they want from a newborn is for the newborn to cry,
Mhm.
to
To
know that there's
breathe.
air, right? In the
Yes.
lungs, and that there's life.
Mhm.
And then and even when they're infants, like how do infants communicate all of their needs?
Yep. Crying.
Through
Yeah.
crying,
A
right?
different type of cry,
Yeah.
but it's a cry.
And you have to differentiate like what
Yeah.
cry is for what. And then once we become verbal, we don't allow ourselves to cry anymore, or
Right.
like, like, why are you crying? Or I'm going to give you a reason to cry.
Mhm.
And a lot of times we just don't allow kids to cry once they become verbal. Like everything's fine, shake it off. And at the end of the day, like crying is biology, it's in our bodies, and the function of crying is to release.
Yes.
And so when we don't allow ourselves to cry, then we internalize everything.
Well, it's a lot of people when they do yoga for the first time, when they do
Yes,
breath work for
you're
the
moving
first
like energy
time,
in
they
your
start
body.
moving that energy around
Hmm.
and they usually start
Yeah.
crying because it's releasing all of that pent up, crap that would turn into
Hmm.
an illness. But you did touch on something that I mean, Inside Out. You said we don't talk to kids about emotions. That's why I loved that movie so much
Oh,
because it really
yes.
did touch on emotions. It's super cute. And I still haven't even seen the second one, which
The
I'm dying
second one
to.
is even better, and I think the second one has touched so many adults because it
Anxiety.
introduces anxiety,
Yeah.
and I know a lot of adults that have watched it that have realized that what they have is anxiety,
Oh,
because
wow.
oftentimes we don't know what anxiety is,
But
right?
see, even adults, that's just
Yes.
it. If we don't talk about it, then people don't think about it. But if we
Yes.
start talking about it, people start thinking about it and start recognizing it in themselves. And then you mentioned kids and teenagers, and that's always my thing. And that's why they're like such a soft spot in my heart. One,
Mhm.
because that's when I was most confused, right? And then obviously my nephew, the same age. It is. You're supposed to just know what to do now
Yeah.
at 18. And that's what drives me crazy about so much in society today. It's like you want to accept that they can answer all these questions at a freaking before 10 or whatever, but
Mhm.
they, can't answer these questions or do drink or drive or because their brain isn't fully functional, or
Developed.
developed. So how can going back to that, because like I said, they're mine, um, my target uh, heart center. How can they navigate that space? How can they learn to communicate where they're at in that space? How can they, one, recognize they're in that space,
Mhm.
communicate to others that they're in that space in order to find some maybe grace, right? From possibly some high achieving parents, and just navigate a little easier, at least recognize it. Like it's okay.
I think it's allowing themselves to sit with it and allowing themselves to feel it, right? Because again, and this really starts at a very young age. I think that we say that kids are resilient, but are they resilient or do they turn to survival mode? Right? Like we see the pandemic.
Yeah.
Like even during the pandemic, so many kids, there's been an increase of depression and anxiety because at the end of the day, we all went through this and it was difficult for adults.
Yeah.
Imagine children.
Yeah.
And
And
children,
they had no
no say.
say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like this is what you do.
Yeah.
And not only that, but screen time also increased for them. And we know
Yes.
what screen time does to kids.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so I think that we don't have conversations with kids oftentimes about feelings because we don't think that they'll understand.
Or
But
the sad part is too, I think it's because a lot of the adults and the parents don't even understand their own feelings or really
correct,
deal with their own feelings,
because we
right?
weren't taught how to connect with our
Mhm.
emotions, right? So then we're not teaching our kids how to connect with their emotions. So it's this generational thing that continues to happen.
Yeah.
And so, how do we as adults start to connect with our emotions? How do we start to allow ourselves to grieve the things that didn't happen for us? And how do we allow ourselves to release so that we are able to model to our children how to
Mhm.
express emotion? Because
Yeah.
at the end of the day, like everybody's trying to do a better parenting job than their parents,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And I think what I see a lot in the work that I do is that a lot of, especially first generation parents, they think that because they're providing better financially for their children or like a safer home environment,
That's the
they think
biggest,
that
I think,
yeah,
misconception.
they think that they've done
Done
it
their
all
job. Yeah.
right. But I think what we are missing, especially culturally, is emotional connection with our
Mhm.
children because oftentimes we're not emotionally connected because we were emotionally neglected.
Yeah.
And so I think that even being able to let yourself accept that you were emotionally neglected and then allowing yourself to feel what that brings up for you,
Mhm.
that in alone is going to be a lot of grief. Because when I started doing my own healing work, like a lot of, I would say I'm a recovering angry person. Um, and it was a lot of grief, right? So once I
Yeah.
started to connect to my own grief and I started to really allowing myself to release it, was I able to not just connect with my grief and release it, but I was able to also connect with other parts of my emotions.
Mhm. That's what frustrates me the most because I see it so often,
Hmm.
and a lot in my own family, is that, people don't know how to express their emotions, or they feel like it's gonna make them weak to say, "Hey, you hurt my feelings."
Hmm.
So it comes out in anger,
Yeah.
and it's like, but you only push people away when you're angry, so you get the total opposite of what you want, and you want that attention that, you're pissed off that you didn't get, but
And
if
that's what
you
you call an adult tantrum, right?
Yes,
Because we don't know how to
absolutely.
process
Yes.
our emotions, and so we have these like outbursts, these
Yes.
emotional outbursts, which is we we don't like when kids do it, and we
Yeah.
try to prevent kids having tantrums. Yet we have them as adults,
Yes.
and then we
Yes.
wonder why our kids have them.
Yes. Yes. Or they don't, and they're all great. And let's see, yeah, my grandson, he's so good. But it's like you said, I'm like, is he so good? Because he's just traumatized. He's like, I just gotta do. I mean, not that they're horrible parents, but and we all come on. I was not the best. We're all healing, right?
Well, also
So
we have to take into consideration that for many of us, we were raised to be obedient, right? And
yeah.
obedience is led with fear. And so many of us are also fearful of expressing our
That's what
emotions.
I'm afraid of. Like he
Yes.
just wants to be good all the time. So
Yeah.
he's not going to be able like learn how to express himself because he's a people pleaser. He already is. I could see it. And he's
Uh,
5.
yeah, and that usually stems from us wanting to feel accepted and validated by our caregivers.
Yeah. So I don't know. We're always worried. Like the more we learn, the more I think we stress if we're doing things right.
But we also have to remember that when we are born and when we're kids, that we are all right brain. And our right brain is the emotional part. It's what we see in Inside Out. Then Inside Out, we see the right brain functioning, right? And so kids are all emotion like we are emotional beings.
Mhm.
And so our job as parents is to help our kids integrate their right brain with their left brain. And the left brain is the logic, the linear, the linguistic, all the else.
Mhm.
And so, how do we help our kids integrate their emotions and their right brain with their left brain, which is the logic and the linear and the linguistic? So, we as parents also have to teach our kids emotional language because
Mm.
they don't have the emotional language.
Right.
So the way that kids express emotion is through behavior.
So what
And
would you say is a good exercise, to start
so,
teaching them, or like maybe a website, or what do you recommend to your patients that come in and
there's not just one answer, right? Because
yeah.
again, it's multidimensional. And I think with kids, I think something that we have to explore is what emotion is behind the behavior.
Mhm.
And when we're raised to be obedient, obedience is done through based on the behavior. And so oftentimes when we're misbehaving,
Mhm.
the behavior gets corrected.
Right.
And so as opposed to
Oh,
exploring what
why?
emotion is behind that
Mm.
behavior.
Mhm.
So why are they behaving this way, right?
Mhm.
Especially if it's a new behavior that you haven't seen
Yeah.
before. So, and even with tantrums, right? There's two types of tantrums. There's the emotional tantrum, like I'm feeling so many feelings, I don't know what to do with my body, so I'm going to release through crying tantrum.
Yes.
And then there's the tantrum of I didn't get what I want, so I'm going to throw a tantrum.
You know, that is one thing about my grandson. He is very vocal. And he is, and he'll say it like, "I don't like the way that makes me feel." And I'm like, "Okay,"
Oh,
you
that's
know?
good, right?
Yeah, it is, which lets me know that he's allowed, right? That
Mhm.
they speak to him that way. So he's allowed to say it, and I respect it because I'm like, "Wow, thank you for letting me know." Like, that's
Yeah.
cool because
And sometimes it's allowing them to explore, well, how does it make you feel? Or like where in your body are you feeling it?
Mhm.
Because we carry emotions in our body. And so like even anxiety, where do we usually feel anxiety? In our stomach.
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
it's like those butterflies, it's not love. It's your nervous system telling you to run, right? It's
Oh.
anxiety. So don't fall for it.
That's only when you're in high school and junior
Right?
high. Yeah.
And so how do we allow ourselves as parents to connect the emotion behind the behavior
Mhm.
so that we are allowing them to also learn their behavior, and it's also labeling their emotions like, oh, I see you're really upset right now,
Mm.
right? Because
Mhm.
you're teaching them to you're putting a label on the emotion that they're feeling, or I see that
Mhm.
you're really frustrated right now,
Yeah.
or oh, that makes you really excited, so that they can start to identify their own emotions. And oftentimes, like you said,
Yeah.
because many of us are not connected to our
That was
emotions,
my next
yeah,
question. How
we
does it
don't know how
right.
to.
So how can an adult start connect well, I would say 1, recommend watching Inside Out, right? Both
Yes,
movies, Inside Out 1 and
2
2,
is really good.
and then they can, like, kinda
Mhm.
get introduced.
But we also have to remember that Inside Out 2 and even the first part, right? Like this is a child that is going through these changes and these emotions with two parents that are very caring and very present and very understanding of her, right?
Mm.
Many of us may not have that as parents.
Yeah.
So you introduce like all of these obstacles or chaos or trauma that you're experiencing along with all of these emotions that you go through at different stages in your life, and it amplifies the emotion.
Yeah. Yeah. So in your practice, what have you noticed is the biggest misconception about grieving?
I think that we only grieve death
Mm.
and that we don't constantly also grieve life and
Yeah.
the transitions in our life and the changes that happen in our life.
I think
And
that's the biggest. That
mhm,
is. That's the biggest because we're alive.
yeah,
People die and we grieve it, but I mean, we're still here
yeah,
and we're still alive and we're still going through life and divorce is, that whole thing and even for me within that grief, it was grieving like the part of me that I lost
yes.
even in the marriage,
Mhm.
right? Like now who am I? And figuring that out at a different age. And So, what are some of the tools that maybe somebody who's finding themselves in a transitional stage can do to kind of just start to maybe get out of a funk that they might be in?
I think being able to find the right support for themselves,
Mhm.
I think having community is essential to our own grief and to our own growth and our own process because we are social beings, right?
Mhm.
Like, and we need community. We need people around us that are going to be healthy and that are going to support us
Yes.
because we need it. I mean, when what's the highest level of um punishment when you're in jail?
Yeah,
Solitary
solitary.
confinement,
Mhm.
and that's because we're social beings.
Mhm. Even the POWs,
Yeah,
they put them away all by themselves.
and so we have to build community around us, but healthy community because sometimes we have family and culturally I think we think that family is everything and we're taught that family is everything, but what happens when your family is the one creating the pain?
Yeah. And
So how do you set those boundaries for yourself, right? And we're going into the holiday season.
that's yes.
And we know, I mean, there's so much out there
Yeah,
about,
yeah.
like,
A lot
having
to
to go back
unpack. A lot
having
to
to go back to your family during the holiday
Yeah.
season, right? And so I think we also have to remember that the holidays also fall at the end of the year during fall
Mhm.
and winter. And so
Yeah.
we are connected to nature, we are nature, and what happens to nature in autumn?
Hibernate.
No, it starts to shed, right? Like the leaves
Oh,
start to
well,
fall off the
yeah, fall.
trees. A lot of plants start to like shed their leaves and their petals, and then in wintertime they go dormant.
Mhm.
And so the same thing happens with us, and we as a society we call it seasonal depression,
Mm.
but it's also grieving and it's a time for us to connect with parts of us that are no longer um serving purpose for us, like versions of ourselves from this year that we no longer need, or emotions that we need to release and shed. And so it's being able to let go and even the time, right? It gets
Yeah.
darker a lot earlier.
Mhm.
So we require a lot more rest. Like
Mhm.
our bodies see that it's dark outside. Like I
Isn't
want to
it
be in
the
bed by
craziest
5:30.
thing? I know. I'm just like,
And
"Why
that's because
wake
our
up
bodies
so
require more rest because we like nature, we also need to hibernate. We also require more rest during the winter season.
So is there any like exercises or personally, right? I'm big on the moon. Tonight's going to
Mhm.
be like super full moon.
Yes.
I'll be out there not like with the drum. If I knew how, I'd be out there with the if I had
Howling.
a drum, I'd probably be out. I just don't have a drum. And I'd figure it out. I feel like it would hit me what I needed to do naturally. I'm kind of crazy like that. But I do releases like
Mhm.
times like these. I have my own little ceremony.
Yep.
But is there something that you recommend to maybe some of your patients, like how they can maybe go about releasing some of the old, and whether it's journaling or going to the beach? I know people throw things in the ocean. Or do you have any exercises or things that you give your patients to do to kind of release that old, and or how to and maybe recognize it? And
Journaling is a great way, right? Because I think that when we put pen to paper, we are able to tap into parts of our brain that our thoughts sometimes can't go deeper into.
Mhm.
So I always encourage to set like a 10-minute timer and just write. Like, don't worry about grammatical errors. Don't worry about any of it. Just write for 10
Mhm.
minutes and really connect to deeper thoughts that we usually don't allow ourselves to tap into.
Yeah.
So, being able to journal, being able to connect with nature, um, yoga is very helpful. Meridian yoga. If you Google, not Google, or yeah, YouTube Meridian yoga,
Mhm.
it's very intentional yoga to move
Oh,
like
I've heard
stuck
of it.
emotional energy
Mhm.
in your body. So there's that. What else? If you have any type of like ceremonies that you like to practice,
Mhm.
intentions.
Yeah. Setting intentions. That's a
Hmm.
good one. Well, and talking about loss, it is that time of year where a lot of people are going to be feeling a
Yeah.
sense of loss, right? So how would you recommend they kind of navigate going through the holidays with that sense of loss?
I think it's allowing them to connect with what they're feeling, right? Because I think, and especially if you've had physical loss
Mhm.
during the holiday season, it's really difficult because we call it the most wonderful time of year,
Yeah.
right? Like everybody's supposed to be cheery and joyous, and it's quite the opposite for many of us.
Yes.
And so, how do you allow yourself to not get sucked into the holiday cheer and spirit?
Mhm.
Because at the end of the day, it's also a time where we're supposed to be a little bit more dormant and we're supposed to be nurturing ourselves. So do what feels right for you. Listen to your body. If this year you want to stay in, then stay in. Because especially the holiday season, gets really busy
Mhm.
with holiday parties and school functions and work functions. And so you're on the go, go, go. And it's actually where we're the season where we're supposed to be getting more rest.
Yes.
And so we're exhausted.
Yeah.
And so that catches up to us in January, right?
Mhm.
So it's being able to be intentional with what you choose to attend. And it's really setting boundaries for yourself and what you're willing to do and not do. And oftentimes we want to attend everything
Yeah.
because,
Well, we
we
don't wanna
don't,
hurt anybody's
yeah,
feelings. It's the holidays. You kinda
yeah.
feel, like, obligated. Which leads me to my next question. Do you have any advice on how they can get out of some of these commitments without feeling, because a lot of times, right, people go, go, go because they just honestly, they're people pleasers as well, right? They don't know how to say,
No.
you know.
No is a complete sentence. No is a complete sentence.
So to believe it and
Yeah.
to stick with it, it's okay
Yeah,
to say no.
but I think it goes back to what we're talking about with emotions, right? I think that a lot of us carry like that shame and the guilt and the fear of, um, because again, our when we're kids, our behaviors are punished. And so whenever we start to feel that emotion that would get us in trouble,
Yeah.
we feel guilty or we don't want to feel it and we try to avoid it.
Isn't it crazy even as adults? Like,
Well, yeah,
I
because
mean,
that's how you're conditioned to feel your feelings, right? Because like if your if your kid seems to be crying a lot more, then they need to release something, right? But if they're constantly getting in trouble for crying, then you're letting them know that that emotion that they're feeling is bad because it's
mm,
getting them in trouble.
mm,
And so that sticks with you. So
mhm.
then as you get older, when you feel that emotion, you feel bad or you feel like you're going to get in trouble.
Is that it, Solomon? Is that why you don't cry?
Oh, I didn't that's so funny. I didn't know you were gonna bring me in at this point.
Yeah. Did you get in trouble when you were little when you cried?
Well, I mean, there's also the whole male element too. We're sort
Mhm.
of raised not to
Yes.
cry, not to show emotion, that type of thing. And so, for me, I can only describe my feeling when my mother passed away. I felt like, okay, I don't really have tears because I don't have regrets. I've always been told crying is a form of self pity. When you're crying, you're feeling sorry for yourself. And so
Mm.
I'm like, well, I don't really have any self pity because I did good by her while she was
Mhm.
here. I took care of her. I made sure she had everything she needed. And I also gave her the freedom to say, look, you're a grown ass adult. You just want to sit in bed and play on your computer all day. Go right ahead.
Yeah.
So what do you want to do? And so that's how I felt. And then I had the additional obligation of taking care of all of the burial and all
Finances
that
and
kind
all
of
that stuff.
stuff. Yeah. So I don't know. After that, I just sort of moved on. But I did find, and this was a question I was going to ask you, do we need to grieve and is it always crying? Because I did go through periods where I felt like I missed her. I missed having that person who, no matter what was going on, they'll tell you it'll be all right. You know what I mean? I'm going through a business. I have good days, I have bad
Mhm.
days, and you just have really no one to talk to, or no one to give you that reassurance. And that's what my mother meant to me.
Yeah.
And so maybe that was part of my grieving process as
Mhm.
well. My brother passed away a year later. He's a year older than me. And I don't know, it just I just I don't know. I maybe it's a brother thing because I honestly feel like he's not really gone, like he's still here doing something, and we're just gonna meet up later on, or it's just how it feels. So it just hasn't really been a big part of my life, the crying and all that stuff. But mention Kobe Bryant and my eyes tear right up. I don't
Solomon.
I don't
Why?
know I don't know
Why
why.
him?
because I don't he was just so much bigger than life, and the way he passed, and I felt like he was just gonna do so much more for the world, and he just meant so much to the city, and, he just represented resilience and fight and, just this not no give up
I have
attitude.
my own conspiracy behind that.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I sorta do too, but I don't know, and it's not really crying, it's more like, because you catch me in a sad movie, I'll be like, "Ooh," you get that little teary-eyed and stuff like that, but
Do you cry sad movies?
I don't cry, I get teary-eyed. Like, crying to me is, where you're just bawling, I don't do that.
You don't allow yourself to get to that level.
I don't think it's that kinda thing, you know what I mean? I don't think it's that kind of emotion, it's more like a happy thing or you know what I mean?
But that's the thing, we cry like
I cry at happy
yeah.
commercials, sad
Crying
commercials.
crying
Yeah,
crying is like the function of crying is to release the overwhelming feeling of any emotion, which is why we cry when we're happy,
Mhm.
when we're sad, when
yeah,
we're scared, when we're excited. Like we cry for different emotions because it's your body releasing that emotion.
Yes.
Angry, like I'm an angry crier, right? Like when I get
Yes,
upset,
yes,
like I
sometimes.
will cry
Mhm.
because I feel like I can't do anything else other than just release through crying.
Yes.
And so but I think you bring up a good point, right? Like we don't allow our men to cry, our boys to
right,
cry. At a
right.
very young age, we say boys don't cry. And at the end of the day, boys are also human and we
Yes.
are emotional beings. And we see the effects of not allowing our boys that
To
turn into our
feel.
men to
Mhm.
feel and to cry. Sorry. And we have this huge world full of angry men.
Mhm. Mhm.
Because at the end of the day, it turns into anger and it
Yeah.
turns into hate and it turns into evil almost. And
Mhm.
so again, I mean, what is behind that? It's the lack of nurturing, the lack of
Mhm.
love, the lack of compassion, the lack of empathy. And again, we can't show other people what hasn't been modeled or nurtured in us.
Right.
Like, I can tell you from a male perspective, it's lack of an outlet, right?
Yes.
Because even when you're married, I mean, there's an expectation that your job is to take care of the family. And, when you get to the point where you need to be vulnerable and your wife's looking at you like, what are you telling me for? What are you crying for? You have no place where you can do that. And you go on social media and every woman is talking about, oh, a man who's crying is a simp and he's weak and all of these things. It just constantly reinforces that narrative that we can't be weak. And and we find that we um we rely on each other in a way, to a certain degree, But then ironically, it becomes male, what is it, men's mental health month, and all these women are talking about, oh, we need to give our men space to do this, and then next month this goes right back to it.
There you
But I
got a
think you
month.
bring up a
Yeah.
great point, right? Like at the end of the day, allowing yourself to cry means that you're allowing yourself to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
And we see vulnerability as a weakness.
And
And
that's the
vulnerability
problem, it's the
is a strength.
perception.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Vulnerability is a strength because it takes a lot for you to allow yourself to be vulnerable.
Yes.
Right.
And
Right.
even and I think even with what you said, like even women don't allow men to cry or they don't like a man that cries. And trust me, I was guilty of that too.
Yeah.
And we have to change that within us because we are the ones raising these boys.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Women are the birthers of life, and we are raising these boys, and we're not allowing our boys to show emotion. So, as women, we have to check our own internalized misogyny,
Yeah. Yeah. But like
right?
I
And the
said too,
concept of what society has told us
yes.
masculine is and feminine is. There's no right or wrong way to be a man, just like there's no right or wrong way to be a woman.
Right.
But society is very clear as to
Yeah.
what the
The
wrong
roles.
way to be a man is.
Mhm.
And that is to be an alpha, like the
Mhm.
right way is to be an alpha and to be strong. But why can't we meet in the middle? Why
Mhm.
can't you be strong? I mean, there's strength in being vulnerable.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I think when we say strong, we probably mean physically strong,
Yes.
not emotionally strong, because we also have a lot of women that don't allow themselves to cry.
Well, and if you're able to be vulnerable, I think you're more emotionally strong.
Yeah,
You're
and
more
you're more connected to
emotionally
yourself and
intelligent,
others.
yes, than
Yeah,
others for sure. But you're right, we don't.
yeah.
It's a crazy thought
So as women,
process.
we need to check our own internalized misogyny.
Mm-hmm. So why don't you explain that a little more?
So I think what comes up for me is that internalized misogyny is when we as women have also indoctrinated this like perception of what masculinity is,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so we raise our boys the way that we think men should
Mm-hmm.
behave. And again, we're emotional beings. So we also have to deconstruct what we've been taught masculinity is so that we are allowing ourselves to raise men that are
Healthy.
more vulnerable and emotionally healthy.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we want to see a change in our men, it starts with us because we are the ones raising them.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of our men, and even with teenagers, right? A lot of moms start to be physically affectionate with their teenage boys because they start going through puberty and then it gets a little bit awkward. But then we're not teaching our boys how to have platonic relationships with the opposite sex.
Mm.
And so we need to continue to show our boys affection and love so that they are emotionally healthy beings.
Mm-hmm.
Because the way that we've been doing it clearly isn't working.
Yeah, yeah. And you're right. I did that. You're absolutely right. It was like a little weird when my son hit that age, right? And,
Mm-hmm.
you kind of stop laying in the same bed or
Mm-hmm.
laying on the couch together. But you're just laying. And my sister did with her son all the time. Like, and then when I see it now, like adults lay on their parents, it's still kind of like, oh, which is crazy because when I was going through, I don't know, I was doing something, but I was kind of down that day. And my mom just happened to she slept over. We were doing something or we went out to a concert, I think the night before. But then I ended up laying on her lap and she started rubbing my head. And I was like, oh, I'm like an adult. And it felt so good.
Yes. Because at the end of the day, you will always be a child when you are with your mother, right?
Yeah.
It's beautiful that you brought that up because even a lot of women don't get that physical affection from their mothers. I don't have a very affectionate mother, right? Like even trying to hug her is so awkward. And so I think we need to allow ourselves space, not just for our men, but for our women, for us to allow ourselves to be vulnerable and to show physical affection to each other and to hold space for each other. And a lot of us don't have that. And so something that I've put into practice in my practice is, when it's a female and they're having a really emotional session is I will ask for permission to sit next to them.
Mm.
Oh,
And
wow.
then if they say yes, then I ask, is it okay if I hold you? And then I hold them.
Mm-hmm.
And it is so healing
Yeah.
to be able to nurture another female that usually does not get that from her mother, right?
Yeah.
So if we need it as women, our men need it as men too.
Yeah.
And we often don't allow space for our men to be vulnerable and to express emotion. And at the end of the day, we have this notion that men are providers, right? But providers of what? And we think it's financial providers.
Mm-hmm.
But men, as the head of households, are not just financial providers, they're also providers of safety,
Mm-hmm.
emotional safety.
Yeah.
But if
Should
our
be,
men,
right?
they
Yes,
should be,
yes.
like in an ideal world,
Yes.
right? But if our men aren't feeling safe,
Mhm.
then guess who else isn't feeling safe?
Mm-hmm.
Women.
That's when chaos
And there's a
erupts in the
lot of
family.
women that are not feeling safe.
Yeah.
And our children aren't feeling safe, and our women aren't feeling safe, and our men aren't feeling safe. And it's a trickle effect.
Yeah.
So how do we create safety within our communities?
Mhm.
And it starts at home. How do we create safe emotional environments for our children to be able to express emotion?
Communication.
Yeah.
I have to start talking.
And vulnerability, right?
Mhm.
Allowing our kids to cry, allowing them to connect with their feelings.
Mhm.
And oftentimes, even with boys, when boys have a lot of emotions, they're considered like the bad kids, right? As opposed to really exploring, well, what's behind their behavior?
Yeah.
What are they feeling?
Well, it's so crazy because you grow and you learn and you meet those adults.
Yeah.
And you're just like, "Aw, poor thing. Like she's such a bitch." I'm sorry. But you could just see it. You see it like in a different, like you recognize the person, the action, but you also recognize that it's a deeper reason. Sometimes people are just rotten, but But they aren't
But
just
why are
rotten,
they
right?
rotten?
Yeah, that's
Yes,
just
like
it.
what
They're
caused that rot,
yes.
right? And
Yeah.
so again, even now, and we have, I mean, jail started as a rehabilitation centers, right? But what are we doing to rehabilitate them emotionally?
Right.
Because again, behind every behavior, there's an emotion.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
even as adults, like even if somebody does something back to you, like one, don't take it personal, right? Because I think that speaks more of them and where they're at emotionally. It does about you.
Right.
But again, like what led them to be that way? It's not like why are you like this? It's like
Yeah.
what happened to you?
Yeah, it's more empathy.
And
Having
so
more
I
empathy.
think we need to approach each other with curiosity as
Mhm.
opposed with judgment. And we are approaching each other with a lot of
Yes.
judgment,
Yes. Yes. Yes.
especially in today's climate, right? There's
Yes.
so much judgment. And as opposed to judgment, being able to approach ourselves with curiosity, I
Mhm.
think allows for connection.
Yes.
And
Absolutely.
and I think that the climate of our nation right now, I think globally actually is fear. And again, and it's fear because many of us were raised to be obedient.
Mhm.
And obedience is led through fear. And with fear comes a lot of shame and a lot of guilt because you're not behaving the way that you're supposed
Yeah.
to. And you're not behaving the American way. And again, everything is fear based. So, and I'm not, fear isn't completely bad, right? Like,
Yeah.
fear also allows us
Keeps
to
us
like
safe
move forward and
sometimes.
keeps
Yeah.
us safe. But then how do we not allow fear to drive our lives?
Right. Control us
Correct.
as opposed to recognizing
Mm-hmm.
when it's more ego driven fear or just, experience fear. Maybe we fell when we were little, right? But it doesn't mean we're going to fall all the time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we're able to move on. Yeah, you brought up the climate today. Let's talk about it. There's a lot of people that are freaked out, and I think people forget in from what they've told me, right? We're going to lose our women's rights. We can fight again. Like nobody's just going to come and take anything away from you. Like we all have a choice. We all have a reason of being here. We all have a voice. Just because one thing is going one way doesn't mean everybody's going to fall in line if something else tries to go another way, right? So how can people feel confident in knowing that they don't have to live in fear, that they do have a voice, and if something happens that they're not feeling that they can speak up. Why do they feel like why do people live in fear and not feel like they could speak up? I mean, we just talked about it, but how can they get a little more confident in speaking up?
That's a loaded question because there's like so many factors that go into it, right? I think it again, us allowing ourselves to connect to our emotions and really connecting our mind and body because we think that we're cognitive beings, but we're not cognitive beings.
Mhm.
We're emotional
Mhm.
beings. And we're so disconnected from our own emotions and ourselves that allowing ourselves to be able to connect the two, I think, again, it will allow us to not be driven by the fear. And also to know that as women, if we're able to shift from seeing ourselves as the oppressed and seeing ourselves as the empowered,
Exactly.
I think that we can move forward, right? But in doing that, we need to continue to work on not allowing the rhetoric to divide us
Mhm.
because it's that division with the internalized
Mhm.
misogyny where we think like, yeah, a man can tell me what to do with my body, right?
Mhm.
So it's our own internalized misogyny that we need to check and
Mhm.
that we need to
Like we've come a long way. Like
yeah,
we have
that
a
we need to
voice. Like
dismantle.
yes. Nobody's going to
Yeah.
control
And
us.
for us to unite, to
Yeah.
really unite as
Right.
women, because at the end of the day, every woman's experience is different,
Right.
right? And we're
And it's
both
not a
women.
political party and it's not a
Yes.
color. It's
And we're both women,
Mhm.
but our experiences as women has been very different.
Mhm.
So again, it's being able to connect through curiosity as opposed through judgment. And we know that society does a really good job
Yes.
at turning women against women.
Yes.
And we're allowing it. So we
Well,
have
and
to take
just people against
accountability.
people.
Yeah. We
Absolutely.
need to take
Yeah.
accountability for our part.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I like that. So it's time to wrap up, but I think that was just a great way to wrap up because it's accountability. We need to take accountability for our own thoughts, our own actions,
And our own healing.
and our own healing and communicating. And yeah, our own healing because we're not going to heal unless we take that first step. And you can start by reaching out to Andrea, right? I mean, you got to hear her. She knows what she's talking about. So, I
Most
mean,
of the time.
honestly, I just think it's awesome to have you. I love
Oh, thank
having you,
you.
and I always love our conversation. It's just so much, like you said, there's so much to unpack,
Hmm.
but I think we do a pretty good job at touching on a little bit of everything. So, thank you guys for joining us. We loved having you on the other side. And please remember to like and subscribe and come back to the other side for another great episode next month. Woo woo.